They were loud, chaotic, and absolutely impossible to look away from. One minute, they were chasing furious debtors down back roads in North Carolina. The next, they were brawling in parking lots while America watched with its jaw on the floor. Lizard Lick Towing wasn't just a reality show. It was a full-blown spectacle. But then, just like that, it was gone. And what happened after the cameras stopped rolling turned out to be even wilder than anything that ever aired on truTV. Back in 2011, when cable TV still dominated and truTV was thriving on chaotic, can't-look-away programming, a couple from a tiny place called Lizard Lick, North Carolina, Ron Shirley and Amy Shirley, took over Monday nights. The show ran for 4 seasons until 2014, delivering 91 episodes of unpredictable energy. On paper, it was simple, a towing company repossessing vehicles. In reality, it was pure chaos. Every episode brought confrontations with people who refused to give up their cars quietly, leading to shouting matches, scuffles, and moments that felt like they could explode at any second. But it wasn't just the madness that hooked viewers. It was the personalities. Ron was loud and intimidating but clearly had a heart. Amy could calm things down or escalate them instantly. And Bobby Brantley brought a kind of unpredictable intensity that made everything feel one step away from total mayhem. At its peak, the show pulled in nearly 3 million viewers per episode, becoming something people talked about like a live event rather than just background TV. But behind all that chaos was a question that never really went away. How real was it? truTV didn't even call it reality TV, preferring the term actuality, which sounded more like a clever workaround than a clear answer. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. The company was real, the people were real, and the repossessions were real, but many scenes were reenactments, exaggerated and scripted to heighten the drama. For many fans, that didn't ruin the appeal. The personalities were strong enough to carry the show regardless. Still, as audiences became more aware of how reality TV worked, the illusion started to crack. Once viewers began questioning the authenticity, the show lost some of its edge. By the time the 4th season aired in 2014, the reality TV landscape had already started shifting. What worked in 2011 didn't hit the same anymore. New shows flooded the space, networks changed direction, and ratings began to dip. In the end, there was no dramatic scandal or explosive fallout, just the usual combination of declining viewership and changing priorities. However, one major change did impact the show's dynamic: Bobby Brantley's departure. As Ron's right-hand man and best friend, Bobby was central to the show's chemistry. When he left to pursue other opportunities, it created a noticeable gap. Reports of tension between him and Ron later surfaced, adding to the sense that things weren't quite the same. When the final episode aired on August 18, 2014, the show ended quietly, without a grand farewell. Long before the cameras arrived, Ron and Amy had already built something real. Ron, born in 1972 in Raleigh, North Carolina, had his football dreams cut short by injury and turned to towing in the early 1990s. He didn't just repossess vehicles. He negotiated, communicated, and tried to keep situations from escalating. By 1998, he had launched Lizard Lick Towing with a single truck, growing it steadily over the years into a full operation. Amy was just as formidable, if not more so. A record-holding powerlifter, former mortician, and co-owner of the business, she brought intensity and balance to everything they built. Their personalities were so striking that producers once considered them for wife swap before realizing they had the potential for something much bigger. The rest of the crew also carved out their own paths after the show. Bobby Brantley faced one of the toughest challenges of all when he was diagnosed with a brain tumor in 2019. After successful surgery, he shifted his focus to family life, moving to a farm and raising 8 children with his wife Melanie. Big Juicy, known off-screen as Elaine McGilliary, kept her life largely private while continuing to raise her children and stay connected to the community. Crazy Dave Eckler embraced his creative side, pursuing music and performing locally. Cousin Johnny stepped away from public life entirely, choosing privacy after years in the spotlight. Swirly Earl remained part of the towing business, continuing the work that made the show possible in the first place. Then came a tragedy that no one could have imagined. In February 2022, Ron Shirley's son, Harley Alexander Shirley, was killed in a shooting at just 21 years old. He had been attending a memorial for a friend when the incident occurred. The attack left another victim, Sophie Hagee, permanently paralyzed. The case led to multiple arrests and lengthy legal proceedings, with convictions and sentencing continuing through 2025. It was a devastating moment that reshaped everything for the Shirley family. In the midst of unimaginable grief, Ron spoke publicly about faith, forgiveness, and resilience, choosing to focus on healing even in the face of loss. Today, more than a decade after the show ended, the story of Lizard Lick Towing is still unfolding. Ron and Amy continue to run their business, which has grown into a fleet of trucks and a full team. Ron also serves as a pastor, while Amy has expanded into writing, even publishing a cookbook. Without a network or production company, they've built a new audience through social media, gaining over 1 million followers on TikTok. The crew remains connected in different ways, and the business continues to thrive, grounded in the same determination that existed long before television ever came into the picture. The show may be gone, but the people behind it never disappeared. They adapted, endured, and kept moving forward through success, change, and heartbreak. In a world where reality TV fame often fades quickly, the story of Lizard Lick Towing stands out, not because of the chaos that made it famous, but because of the resilience that kept it alive long after the cameras stopped rolling. And maybe that's the part no one really expected, because when a show like that ends, you assume the story ends with it. The noise fades, the characters disappear, and whatever made it feel larger than life slowly turns into a memory people revisit in clips and nostalgia threads. But that didn't happen here. If anything, the absence of cameras revealed something more grounded, more real than anything the show ever tried to capture. What made Lizard Lick Towing work in the first place wasn't just the confrontations or the chaos. It was the sense that underneath all of it, these were people who actually lived this life every day. And when the spotlight disappeared, they didn't have anywhere else to go. They went right back to work. Same roads, same risks, same unpredictable moments, just without an audience watching from their couches. Over time, that kind of consistency starts to feel rare. Reality TV has a pattern: rise fast, burn bright, disappear even faster. But Ron and Amy never really played by those rules. They didn't pivot into something completely different or try to reinvent themselves into something more polished. They stayed exactly who they were, just in a quieter, more controlled way. And strangely, that made their story even more compelling. There's also something to be said about how the audience changed. Back in 2011, viewers were drawn to the chaos without asking too many questions. Now, people look deeper. They want to know what's real, what happened after, what the cost was. And in that sense, the story of Lizard Lick Towing aged into something more meaningful. It stopped being just entertainment and started becoming a timeline of ambition, of pressure, of loss, and of endurance. Even the cast members who stepped away tell part of that story. Some found peace in private lives, away from the unpredictability that once defined them. Others stayed connected to the brand in quieter ways, showing up for events or supporting the community that grew around the show. And then there are those like Bobby, whose life took turns no script could have written, reminding everyone just how thin the line is between television drama and real-life struggle. But through all of it, the core never really changed. The trucks still roll out. The calls still come in. The work still gets done. It's not packaged for television anymore, not edited into dramatic arcs or cliffhangers. It's just life, unfolding the way it always has, messy, unpredictable, sometimes heavy, sometimes strangely ordinary. And maybe that's why people are still drawn to it even now. Not because it's louder or more extreme than everything else out there, but because it feels like something that didn't disappear when it was supposed to. It just kept going out of sight, building a different kind of story. In the end, Lizard Lick Towing didn't really need a final episode. There was no clean resolution, no moment where everything wrapped up neatly. Instead, it turned into something ongoing, something that doesn't fit into a single season or a fixed narrative. A business that survived television. A family that endured unimaginable loss. A group of people who, despite everything, kept moving forward. And if there's anything more compelling than chaos on a screen, it's that what happens when the cameras leave and the story keeps going anyway. And that continuation, the part no network ever packaged or promoted, is where the story quietly becomes something else entirely. Because once the spotlight is gone, there's nothing left to perform for. No edits, no retakes, no manufactured tension. Just choices. Just consequences. Just real life unfolding in real time. For Ron and Amy, that meant carrying everything forward without the safety net of television. The business still had to run. Employees still depended on them. Bills didn't care whether the cameras were there or not. And in a strange way, that's what makes their journey stand out. They weren't built by TV, they were revealed by it. When it ended, they didn't collapse. They just went back to being exactly what they were before, only now with the weight of everything they'd experienced layered on top. Grief, especially, has a way of reshaping everything around it. After the loss of Harley, nothing could ever feel the same again. Not the work, not the routine, not even the sense of purpose that had driven them for decades. And yet, they kept going. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quiet, almost invisible way people do when they don't have another option. One day at a time. One decision at a time. Carrying something that never really gets lighter, only more familiar. That kind of resilience doesn't look like what people expect. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the fact that the doors still open in the morning, that the trucks still leave the lot. That life, no matter how altered, keeps moving forward. And in that sense, the real story of Lizard Lick Towing was never about the fights or the chaos. It was about endurance. Even the audience's relationship with the show has changed over time. What once felt like explosive entertainment now carries a kind of weight when people look back on it. Those moments of shouting and tension feel different when you know what came after, when you understand that behind every exaggerated scene were real people with real lives that didn't pause when the episode ended. And maybe that's why the story still lingers. Not because it was the wildest thing on TV, but because it didn't follow the usual script. It didn't crash and burn. It didn't fade into complete obscurity. It transformed, quietly, gradually, into something less visible, but more lasting. There's a certain honesty in that kind of ending, or lack of one. No grand finale, no closing credits that tie everything together. Just an open-ended continuation that reflects how life actually works. Messy, unfinished, always moving. So if you step back and look at it now, years removed from the peak of its fame, Lizard Lick Towing feels less like a show and more like a chapter. A loud, chaotic chapter, sure, but not the whole story. The real story is everything that came after. The rebuilding, the adapting, the surviving. Because when everything else is stripped away, the cameras, the attention, the noise, what's left is the part that was always real to begin with. And that part didn't end in 2014. It's still going. Quietly. Steadily. One day at a time. And maybe the most striking thing about all of it is how ordinary that continuation actually looks from the outside. No headlines every week. No viral moments engineered for attention. Just a business operating, a family living, and time doing what it always does, moving forward whether anyone is watching or not. There's something almost ironic about that. A show built on chaos, confrontation, and noise ultimately leaving behind a legacy defined by quiet persistence. The same people who once filled screens with shouting matches and high-stakes repossessions are now navigating a reality that doesn't come with background music or dramatic cuts. And in that silence, you start to see them differently. Because without the edits, without the framing, what remains is character. Not the kind written for television, but the kind revealed over years, through consistency, through hardship, through the simple act of not giving up when it would have been easier to step away. That's not something you can script. That's something you live. And for the people who once watched every episode, there's a strange kind of realization that comes with looking back. What felt unpredictable back then now feels almost contained compared to what life eventually brought their way. The fights, the arguments, the chaos, it all seems smaller when placed next to real loss, real recovery, real endurance. But that doesn't diminish what the show was. If anything, it adds another layer to it. It turns those episodes into snapshots of a time before everything changed. Before grief reshaped priorities. Before life demanded a different kind of strength. It becomes less about what was happening on screen and more about who those people were in that moment before they had to become something more. And that's where the story settles now. Not in the past, not entirely in the present, but somewhere in between. A reminder that what we see is never the full picture. That behind every loud moment, there's a quieter one waiting. Behind every peak, there's a stretch of time where things level out and continue, often unnoticed. Lizard Lick Towing didn't end with a dramatic collapse or a perfect resolution. It just kept going, in a way that feels almost stubborn against the expectations of how stories are supposed to work. And maybe that's what makes it stick. Not the chaos that made it famous, but the continuation that refused to disappear. Because in the end, the most real thing about it was never the fights or the spectacle. It was the fact that when everything else faded, the lights, the cameras, the attention, life didn't. It kept moving, steady and unfiltered, carrying everyone with it into whatever came next. And what comes next is never as clear as people expect it to be. There's no roadmap for life after something like that. After the attention, after the loss, after the identity you once had gets reshaped by time. It's not about starting over completely. It's about adjusting, slowly, to a version of life that looks familiar on the surface, but feels entirely different underneath. For some, that adjustment means stepping away from everything that once defined them. For others, it means holding on to it, not out of nostalgia, but because it's still a part of who they are. And in the case of Lizard Lick Towing, it became something in between. The name stayed. The work stayed. The people, in many ways, stayed. But the meaning behind it all shifted. What used to be a spectacle became a routine. What used to be entertainment became responsibility. And what used to be shared with millions is now lived mostly out of sight, in moments that don't get replayed or analyzed. There's a kind of honesty in that transition that most shows never get to show, because most stories don't continue long enough for it to happen. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Not because it was perfect, or even entirely real in the way people once believed, but because it evolved into something that is undeniably real now. Time stripped away the exaggeration, the heightened drama, the need to perform, and what's left is something quieter, but far more grounded. You can almost think of it as two different stories that just happen to share the same name. One played out on television, fast, loud, unpredictable. The other unfolded afterward, slower, heavier, but more meaningful in ways that don't translate to ratings or episodes. Most people only ever see the first one. The second one is the part you have to look for. And if you do, you start to understand that the real impact of something like Lizard Lick Towing isn't measured by how many people watched it at its peak. It's measured by what remained when the peak passed, by how the people at the center of it handled everything that followed, the change, the pressure, the unexpected turns that no script could have prepared them for. Because that's the part no one signs up for. The part where the story keeps going but the audience moves on. The part where you have to define yourself without the framework that once made everything make sense. And the fact that they managed to do that without completely losing what they built is, in its own way, more impressive than anything that ever made it to air. So the story doesn't really end. It just becomes less visible, less amplified. Still there, still unfolding, just without the noise that once made it impossible to ignore. And maybe that's the final takeaway. Not every story is meant to have a clean ending. Some of them are defined by what happens after the ending people expected, by the quiet stretch of time where things continue, unannounced, shaping themselves into something new. Lizard Lick Towing was never just about what you saw on screen. It was about what could survive beyond it. And as it turns out, what they built didn't need the cameras to keep going. It never did.